Barbara Lee, and I am so proud to represent the 13th Congressional District of California, the beautiful Berkeley, Oakland, Bay Area, and I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, so I want to just say hello to everybody and hope all is well, hope you're healthy and safe. I'm so happy to be with you this evening to welcome you to the Bay Area Book Festival's one-day virtual mini festival, which is an important moment for all of us tonight, especially to be talking with our dean of the UC Berkeley Law School. He's an author and one of the top legal minds in the nation, Dean Erwin Cherminsky. Thank you, Erwin, for understanding Chemerinsky.
As I said, I envy people who have three-letter last names.
Okay. Thank you so much, Don. I'm so happy to be with you and to meet you. And really, this is your moment to talk about our current political and judicial state, which is affected now by our interpretation of the Constitution and how we can hope for a better future. We're now just weeks away from the November election. Voting has already started in some states. And it's not an exaggeration to say that the future of democracy is on the ballot. Everything is at stake. Our civil rights, voting rights, our right to a livable planet. And yes, I always say this election is about also life and death. There are few things as formative and as powerful as tipping the balance as an interpretation of the United States Constitution by the Supreme Court. As one of the nation's preeminent constitutional law scholars, Erwin asserts that there has never been a more important time to adopt a progressive vision of the United States Constitution, which is, of course, a living blueprint that can ensure justice, equality, and opportunity for all. So welcome to all. Welcome to our dean. It's so good to be here with you virtually. And I just want to ask you, before we start our questions, could you just give us a little bit of your background and how you became to be such an expert at constitutional law? I mean, you are a true scholar, and we are so honored that you're the dean of my alma mater. So good to see you, Erwin. And why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
You're so kind to say that. It's really my great pleasure to do this with you. Congressman Lee, you've been one of my heroes for a long time. It's good to do a program together. It's very special. How did I get here? I grew up on the south side of Chicago. Grew up in a working class family. Neither my parents nor brother, sister went to college. I went to college in law school. I went to law school because I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. I was so much inspired by the civil rights lawyers of the 1950s and the 1960s. And I practiced law for a while in Washington, D.C., and then became a law professor in the fall of 1980, 40 years ago. I remember going home after my first class teaching and saying to my wife, this is what I want to do forever. And when I went to law school, my passion was constitutional law. And I speak to you now, a lot of years later, and my passion is still constitutional law. And I think the reason is the Constitution, this is how it's interpreted by the Supreme Court, affects all of us, often in the most important, the most intimate aspects of our lives.
Well, I tell you, again, you're the right man for the right time. I mean, given our beloved Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her passing. Let's start there. I tell you, she was phenomenal. The fight around her successor, of course, really is going to be a fight. A few days ago, and I'm so glad you published this, you published an op-ed in the LA Times arguing that the Democrats have a secret weapon to thwart Trump naming her replacement. Can you tell us what is at stake? And of course, I want to know, and I think all those with us want to know what that secret weapon is, because I want you to know I'm going to go back and brief our Democratic caucus also to make sure that this input is provided.
The Republicans have packed the Supreme Court. 4 years ago, they did something unprecedented. Antonin Scalia died in February of 2016. A month later, President Obama nominated Chief Judge Merrick Garland for the seat. Chief Judge Garland was impeccably qualified. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said, in an election year, the voters should choose who's going to fill the seat on the Supreme Court. And he said, no hearings, no vote on the Garland nomination. It was unprecedented. 24 times in American history, there have been a vacancy in the last year of a president's term. In 21 of the 24, the Senate confirmed the president's nomination. In 3, they didn't. But to say no hearings, no vote, and for all those months. Well, last Friday, of course, Justice Ginsburg passed away. I immediately thought, well, then the Republicans who said leave it to whoever's elected in November would also agree here. Let's just wait and see who's elected on November 3rd. But just minutes after Justice Ginsburg's death was announced, Mitch McConnell said, we're going to be holding hearings and we're going to be holding a vote. I was hopeful that there'd be 4 Republican senators who would have some shame and say, it's just wrong given what we did 4 years ago. But I was wrong. Now appears there's a Senate majority to confirm, and to confirm whoever it is President Trump picks. President Trump is going to pick somebody very conservative. We know who the names are on the list. Together with Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, this is going to give us the most conservative Supreme Court perhaps ever in American history. And I don't think the Democrats can practice unilateral disarmament. I think, Congressman, the Democrats have to step up. And I think that the weapon that you have is to increase the size of the Supreme Court. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the size of the Supreme Court. That's set by federal law. It's varied from 5 justices to 10 justices over the course of American history. And I think what the Democrats need to make clear is it's the Republicans who pack the court. This is simply restoring balance.
Good point. That will be relayed to my colleagues, and thank you very much. Now, in 2014, of course, you wrote that Justice Ginsburg should step down so that President Obama could put forward a successor. One reason the stakes are so high is that these are lifetime appointments. Should we reconsider appointing justices for life in an era when someone like Brett Kavanaugh, my goodness, could serve on the court for 30 years or longer? I mean, this is a long time. Look at how long has Clarence Thomas been there now?
My answer is yes, we should end life tenure for Supreme Court justices. I favor 18-year non-renewable terms. I proposed this years ago. Many others have proposed it as well. Why? Well, thankfully, life expectancy is a lot longer now than it was in 1787 when the Constitution was written. The average life expectancy in 1787 was 36 years old. Clarence Thomas, who you mentioned, was 43 years old when he went onto the Supreme Court in 1991. If he stays on the court until he's 90, the age at which Justice John Paul Stevens retired, he'll be a justice for 47 years. Or we can think of Justice Kagan or Chief Justice Roberts, who were 50 years old when they went on the court. They could easily be there for 40 years. One of the names that's being mentioned for President Trump to choose among is Allison Jones Rushing. She's 39 years old. The frontrunner, Amy Coney Barrett, is 48 years old. That's just too much power in a single person for too long a period of time. Also, too much depends on the accident of history. Did you know that since 1960, there's been a Republican president for 32 years and a Democratic president for 28 years, almost even. But Republicans counting this pick will have gotten to pick 15 justices for the Supreme Court, and Democrats only 7. Why is that? Well, it's when vacancies occur. Richard Nixon had 4 vacancies in his first 2 years as president. Jimmy Carter had no vacancies during his term as president. George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, they all had a couple of picks, but Donald Trump has already had 3 picks.
Mm. That's scary, the way you put it, and it's very clear that you are a scholar and you understand this very well. I think it's important also just to mention my own view about term limits. For elected officials, I believe it's up to the people to decide when they want to elect or not elect their representatives. But we have to make a distinction, I think, between elected officials and appointed officials. And I think that that's a very good point in terms, you say 18 years, that's a long time. And I think that that's something that should be considered. And again, I love this conversation because I'm definitely going to take this back to some of our leadership discussions. So thank you very much. In terms of the court's role in the elections, in 2000, Bush versus Gore decision, that determined the outcome of the election. Now, just to mention, I was one of the 7 or 8 on the floor that Saturday challenging that and kept getting shut down by, I guess it was, who was presiding then? Was it Vice President Gore? Yeah, I think he was presiding over that. And so do you envision a scenario again and how it can be avoided?
I'm so afraid of how this is going to play out. One scenario, of course, is that Biden will win so decisively that legal challenges don't matter and nothing goes to the Supreme Court. There's also the possibility Donald Trump could win so decisively it doesn't need to go to the Supreme Court. But there's also the possibility that in one or more states it could be contested, very close, and the courts will decide. That's what happened in 2000 when one state, Florida, was going to determine who was president, and it ultimately went to the Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore. I worry about whether or not the court's going to need to get involved in another way that's unprecedented in American history. Just yesterday, President Trump was asked whether he would support a peaceful change in power. And he said he didn't know. He needed to see the election results. There's a lot of fraud going on. This country has been around for over 200 years. No incumbent president has ever said, I might stay in office even if I'm deemed the loser. We've seen that happen in other countries in the world, but not in American democracy. And I'm really worried about that too. And then what role would the courts need to play to say, the Electoral College has spoken, that's who the president is going to be, and it's not you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're at that tipping point. We're at a very dangerous moment. I think Trump they understand this. Certainly Trump knows that he needs a full Supreme Court because of the results of the election could be litigated no matter what. And so if we have an 8-member court the night of the election on November 3rd, and the court is tied on decisions affecting the outcome of the election, what happens next? How do we determine a winner? Can you kind of map this out, the 26-26 rule?
Sure.
Supposedly, and the Electoral College and all of the
My hope is that none of this will matter. My hope is there's going to be a decisive winner, not November 3rd, soon after when the absentee ballots are counted. But if it goes to the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court had 8 justices and it was tied 4-4, then the Supreme Court affirms the lower court decision without any opinion. So imagine it had come from the Florida Supreme Court and it went to the Supreme Court and they split 4-4. Then the Florida Supreme Court decision stands and Al Gore might have actually become president. But with 9 justices, it was 5-4 in favor of Bush over Gore. If no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College, and that seems unlikely, then, Congressman, it goes to the House of Representatives, and each state casts 1 vote in the House of Representatives, and then it'll depend on who won the delegation in each state on November 3rd.
Yep. And there's a December 12th date also, I believe. Can you explain the December 12th deadline? Because I think that's what we got caught up in with Bush versus Gore.
Very much so. This is a statute passed by Congress, and it creates a safe harbor for states in choosing their electors to the Electoral College. It says if a state has chosen its electors by that date, then those electors will be seated in the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College is a fiction. It never actually meets. Even pre-COVID, it never actually meets. It sends in its votes, but a state that's chosen its electors by that date will get to seat them. But even if a state doesn't meet the safe harbor date, they still can be seated in the Electoral College. In 1960, that happened in Hawaii. It's happened sometimes with other states. But that's what the December 12th date is about.
Okay, I remember that very well in Bush versus Gore. Boy, I tell you, they stole that one. And a year before Trump was elected, now you wrote a book, I think the book was called The Case Against the Supreme Court. You argued that the court has been far more likely to uphold government abuses of power than to stop them. It's 4 long years later. Has the court done anything to change your assessment in the last 4 years?
No. My thesis wasn't that the Supreme Court never succeeds. My thesis was that at the most important times in American history, the Supreme Court has failed us. I can point to the Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court so emphatically ruled in favor of the institution of slavery, or the Korematsu decision, World War II, where the Supreme Court upheld the evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans. The last 4 years, well, think of Trump versus Hawaii 2 years ago, that upheld the ability of President Trump to institute a travel ban that was so clearly based on animus against Muslims. He himself had said he wanted a Muslim ban, and yet the Supreme Court 5-4 upheld this. There have been some pleasant victories in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court this term 5-4 saying that President Trump could not rescind DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program. But I think with Justice Ginsburg gone and with 5 conservative justices, the chance of those occasional victories is to become infinitely less.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, that explains in some respect, going back to lower courts and what you said, why the Republicans have been doing nothing but passing and nominating and appointing judges, excuse me. That's all they've been doing since Trump has been in.
And they've done it incredibly well.
Very well.
One of those long-lasting legacies of any president who's who the president appoints to be federal judges. And Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell know that. And I think Trump will have appointed as many judges in 4 years as Obama in 8 years. Yep. And they've appointed young judges. They've appointed very conservative judges. And talk about packing the court. That's what they've done. That's what they've done.
And Erwin, I'll get to the next question in a minute, but the more I listen to you talk, the more I am convinced that this autocratic state that we're marching toward, people need to understand what's happening in terms of just the signs that are there and how they have really, in many ways, I won't even say begun to erode our democracy, but how they're chipping away at it where you can see it now right before your eyes. And that's another level and another layer of it. And that's the appointments of all of these very conservative, younger federal judges. And I'm telling you, that's all they do over there in the Senate. So, and they're not working for the people, they're working against the people, which leads me to your next book, We the People, a progressive reading of the Constitution for the 21st century. Now, can you tell us what a progressive vision of the Constitution is and why we need it now and what we can do to get it?
I'll tell the story how this book came to be written. I was convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win in November 2016. And I decided I wanted to write a book of, now that we'll have a progressive Supreme Court, for the first time in my professional career, what should they be doing? And I developed a proposal for my literary agent. I know this sounds pretentious, but that's how it's done to get a book published, for her to give to publishers to try to get a contract to write the book. And I worked for a couple of months polishing my proposal. And then the election happened. And the next day, my literary agent Bonnie Nadell wrote me and said, quote, "It's scrap paper now." And I was very upset by the election results. But after thinking about it, I said, I still want to write this book. Even if it's not going to be directed at the Supreme Court this year, it really has to be directed at what the court should be doing in the future. And I say in the book, the values of the Constitution are found in its preamble. And we often forget what's in the preamble. The preamble is a reminder that we should have democratic governance. I think that's what "we the people" is all about in those first few words. It's about creating an effective government. It's about ensuring justice. It's about protecting liberty. And then I say in the book, there's one value that's not mentioned in the preamble, and that's equality. And of course, the Constitution was written, institutionalized slavery. And what I try to do in the book is take each of these values and say, what would it mean to have a court that wanted to ensure democratic governance, that wanted to provide for effective government, that really wanted to provide for justice, that wanted to secure liberty, and that wanted to advance equality? And I go through examples in each of those areas.
Well, you know, what you just laid out, okay, a progressive reading of the Constitution, but that's what the Constitution is. And so why are there those who believe that they cannot adopt the realistic, practical, progressive view of the Constitution when that's basically what it is? I mean, it's a shame we have to say the progressive reading of the Constitution because others just have misrepresented it through the centuries.
For decades, conservatives have tried to say, well, we're just following the original meaning of the Constitution. And one of the things that I argue in the book is, that's nonsense. Now, to begin with, we'll never know the original meaning of the Constitution. And it's a fiction to say there was one intent among everybody who was in Philadelphia and everybody who was in the constitutional ratifying conventions. But even if somehow we could know what they intended, it's not very relevant for our time. The same Congress that ratified the 14th Amendment, that includes the Equal Protection Clause, also voted to segregate the District of Columbia public schools. That means if you really want to follow the original meaning, Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided. And any theory that makes Brown illegitimate is one that we should repudiate. I'll give you an example. The Constitution refers to the president and vice president with the pronoun he. The framers clearly meant that the president and vice president would be men. If we really had to follow the framers' intent, it would make it unconstitutional to elect a woman as president or vice president until the Constitution's amended. That shows the problem with originalism. And what I try to argue in the book is, long ago, Congressman, Chief Justice John Marshall said, we must never forget it's a Constitution we're expounding, Constitution to be adapted and endure for ages to come. It's a Constitution that's meant to be, as you said, a living document.
Yeah. So that means I'm 3/5 of a human being, if in fact we subscribed to their interpretation of the Constitution. I tell you, this election has got to be decisive, November 3rd. Local jurisdictions, states like California, and of course the city of Oakland have had some success in checking Trump's abuse of power through legal challenges. California has filed now, I believe it's 100 lawsuits against Donald Trump and has won a number of them, including one that stopped Trump from defunding sanctuary cities and another one that actually blocked the administration from adding a question about citizenship to the United States Census. Is litigation an effective check on a lawless executive branch? And if so, can it continue with a super conservative, super majority on the Supreme Court?
Those are the crucial questions that we'll see in the next few years. Litigation is often the only recourse. When there are constitutional scholars who, in the face of what the Supreme Court is now, is going to be saying, we should just advocate eliminating judicial review, that the courts are and have so long been conservative. And yet, when I think of the people who I've represented as a lawyer in my career, I represented a Guantanamo detainee. I represented a homeless man in the Supreme Court challenging a religious symbol outside the Texas state capitol. I argued death penalty cases in the Federal Court of Appeals in the Fourth Circuit in Richmond. When I think of those clients, it's really litigating for them in the courts or nothing. I might lose. They lose much more often than they win. But where are we going to go if not the courts? Congresswoman, how long would it have taken for southern state courts or southern state legislatures to end segregation if not for Brown versus Board of Education?
Yeah, yeah. And coming from Texas, I remember the days when I couldn't go to public schools because I was Black. So I understand that very clearly. But what now I'm concerned about is this. After Trump was elected, my constituents, of course, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this? I said, well, we have to hold everything up in court. We've got to file lawsuits. We've got to litigate. We've just got to put, just keep them in court. Just keep them in court. But now we have so many judges that had been appointed to the courts by Trump. I mean, 4 years later, I'm saying I'm not sure if I would respond that way. And so given what Trump has done now, 4 years later, can you kind of tell me what I would say to constituents had we known this would happen in terms of his appointments?
After President Trump was elected in 2016, my students convened a large assembly. They were very upset, and they asked several people, including me, to speak. And what I said to them is that I was as upset as they were, but we really have only two choices: to give up or fight harder, which means we have to fight harder and better than we have before. And one of those tools we have to fight is through litigation. And as you said in your examples, sometimes it works. Think of when President Trump tried to rescind the DACA program and put 800,000 people in danger of being deported. The courts stopped him from doing that. When President Trump wanted to include a question on the census about citizenship to try to discourage especially Latinx people from filling out census forms, the court said, no, he can't do that. Or more recently, he said he doesn't want undocumented individuals counted for purpose of the census and for apportionment. And a 3-judge federal court stopped him, and hopefully the Supreme Court will stop him. So we can't rely just on the courts. I think, Congressman, we need you in Congress and state legislatures and city councils to do more than ever. We're going to have to turn to state courts and state constitutions more than ever. But in reality, it's often the courts are nothing. That's why I admire Attorney General Javier Becerra so much for all those lawsuits you mentioned that he's filed.
Yeah. And one thing that I think in terms of civic education, what I've learned is that a lot of people weren't taught the relationship, our young people, between voting, a governor or a president, and the courts and justice, and what all that means and how that's all tied together. And so I'm one for civic education from grammar school all the way through.
Absolutely, and all of our responsibilities. It's a responsibility, I often say, of all of the lawyers and law professors and law students and judges to go to middle schools and high schools. When I used to be at Irvine, I would go to every 8th grade class in the Irvine Unified School District because they all study the Constitution. And for all the people who are watching, even if you're not lawyers, still to go out to the schools, to go to the Rotary and the Lions Clubs and every place else to help educate people about our system.
That's right. And I'm not an attorney, but I carry my Constitution around and try to cite article and, chapter, article, verse, title, all of the amendments to the Constitution, because it's a living document, and it's something that I have to reference, especially dealing with authorizations to use force and and Congress's responsibility and the 3 branches of government and the separation of powers. And, young people need to understand what the Constitution means and how politics and elected officials and one's involvement is directly and correlates directly to judicial decisions. And that is a stretch for a lot of people who weren't taught this in grammar school. Mm-hmm. So our democracy, are you hopeful for our democracy? What would your advice be to citizens? And where do you think we go from here?
I wish we could have this conversation on November 4th.
We will.
Because to me, what's at stake in this election is the future of our democracy. The reality is no form of government lasts forever. Democracies are there until they're not. And I have never seen the threat to democracy that I'm seeing right now. The idea that the president could say, even if you lose the election, he might not leave office. The way in which there's this systematic effort to suppress the vote. And this isn't hyperbole. I really worry that if Donald Trump is reelected, our democracy can't survive that for 4 more years.
Yeah.
Trump believing that he has a mandate, Trump believing that the people support what he's doing. He wants to be Putin and will do everything he can to try to take on those powers. So I think the most important thing for anybody who's listening is to go out and vote and to get all the people you know to vote, and especially get people in states other than California to go vote, because our democracy depends on it like never before.
It used to be radical to use the word fascism. I remember when Trump, it's not anymore. I mean, Madeleine Albright used the F word in her book, and I'm glad she did. But I remember when Trump was first elected, I was talking with Michael Moore, and he referred me to a book, I believe it was called The 21st Century Signs of Fascism. And I think, you know, we need to go back and try to look at where we are in historical context, because many of those signs are there today. And we can't just see this as an election in normal times with a Democrat or a Republican running against each other. Democracy is on the ballot. And we have to recognize that when we vote on November 3rd, we're really voting to preserve what's left of our democracy and to build it back up again. Your book, it's a new book. Co-writer is Howard Gilman.
Yes.
It's called The Religion Clauses, the case for separating church and state. Now, again, you're the man, the right man for the right time. Why this book now?
Thank you so much for mentioning it. It just came out. We're in the midst of an enormous change in constitutional law from the Supreme Court with regard to the religion clauses. And I and my co-author, Howard Gilman, who's the chancellor at UC Irvine, are very troubled by this. In 1947, all 9 justices then on the Supreme Court said that the prohibition of establishment of religion was, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, about creating a wall that separates church and state. Now, and especially with the new justice, we're going to have a majority that rejects any idea of a wall separating church and state. They believe the government only violates the Establishment Clause if it coerces religious participation. So from their perspective, religious symbols like cross and nativity signs on government property are fine. The government not only can give aid, but must give aid to religious schools. The other provision of the First Amendment is the Free Exercise Clause. And 30 years ago, it was Justice Scalia who said, we don't give exceptions based on the Free Exercise Clause to general laws based on people's religious beliefs. But now we have a majority on the court that's doing exactly that. They're saying that if an employer has a religious objection, or even a conscious objection to contraceptives, doesn't have to provide insurance coverage for women employees. I think we're on the verge of the court saying that business owners of all kinds, bakers, florists, videographers, can discriminate against gay and lesbian couples. I think the Supreme Court's about to say that all employers, if they want, don't have to hire gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals if the employer has a religious objection to that. And we want to present what's happening now and also critique it and say why we think it's wrong.
Good, good. Thank you very much for that. I co-chair the pro-choice caucus. Of course, Roe versus Wade is really in jeopardy, given Donald Trump's push now to put another justice on. We're trying to repeal the Hyde Amendment, which has denied women, low-income women, women of color, access to the full range of reproductive services and healthcare, including abortion. You know, and the arguments always are religious arguments. It's like, you know, it's my religion that says this is wrong for you. And that is so dangerous. It's so unconstitutional. So your book now is going to be a real guidepost and set up a framework for us to really address this, because it's coming even now harder, heavier, and in your face.
Roe versus Wade is going to be overruled now. I wish I could have the slightest glimmer of hope, but there were already 4 justices, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, who were ready, eager to overrule Roe v. Wade. With the new pick by President Trump, they'll have their 5th vote. They don't need to worry about where John Roberts is going to be on that question.
Yeah. And so coming back to the election, November 3rd, I hope that women understand that what voting for Trump really means to them, their lives, their girls, and their children and their families. Not to mention the environment, not to mention voting rights, not to mention racial justice, not to mention LGBTQ equality, not to mention gender equality. We can go on and on and on and on and on what this election means and why we must vote. And I think you have really laid out all of the constitutional issues and why we're living now with an administration that really violates the Constitution each and every day. It's an unconstitutional, lawless administration. And with your scholarship and your background and your credibility, it's so wonderful and refreshing to hear you talk about this in a very scholarly, and thank goodness you're the dean, teaching young people the true meaning of the Constitution, because we're at that point now. We're at that tipping point. And so I don't know if you can, do you want to ask us any questions, Erwin? Feel free if there's anything you want to ask us, because we're about ready to close. And
I would love the chance. I'd love the chance to. Here's my question, Congresswoman, but everyone in the audience would be interested. What most surprises you in being a member of Congress? What did you least expect when you got there? And what still surprised you today after all these years in the House of Representatives?
Well, what surprises me is that we all want to win re-election because we want to fight for our constituents, for the preservation of democracy. We have our reasons, and people elect us for those reasons. But what I have found and learned is that a lot of members see Congress as being the end of their life. And so in not seeing a life that's beyond Congress, you end up voting or engaging in, I think, and I won't say compromises, in agendas and in policies that you may or may not want to, instead of trying to stick with your principles and your values. And that's not a condemnation of anyone. That's just saying that I think that what surprised me is that as hard as people work and as much as they represent their constituents, you get caught up in this every 2 years, and so the fundraising piece is horrendous. We've got to get to public financing of campaigns, because we have to raise money all of the time just to win re-election. You know what I mean? And so you end up not doing half of what you could do if you didn't have to spend so much time raising money. And you raise the money because you want to be reelected, naturally, because you want to serve your constituents and you want to do everything you want to do. But it gets to the point where it's like, that's the end all. And that has got to change, because we have some brilliant, especially Democrats, members, younger members who want to change the world and get caught up in having to just go from election to election to election to raise money. And that's very, that doesn't bode well for our democracy. We need public financing of campaigns.
I so agree with you. I'm so proud to be one of your constituents, so proud that you're my Congresswoman.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm proud you're my dean of my alma mater. I wish I could come take one of your classes. Do you do online classes for returning students?
This semester, everything is online.
Yeah, and I tell you, and especially this day and time, and I definitely will talk to some folks, and maybe we can do a Democratic caucus briefing. I would
It would
love for
be
you to weigh
wonderful.
in with especially our progressive caucus too. So I will definitely follow up with you. But this has been really great, and I just want to thank our Bay Area book festivals, Berkeley Unbound, for giving us this opportunity to be with you tonight, to learn so much. Being just a few weeks out from the election, I can't think of another person who would be able to put where we are in context and give us some hope, really, and give us some options and really tell the truth, because it's truth telling time for everyone in this country. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.